What began as the solution to a looming plague outbreak soon turned into a lucrative scheme that involved smuggling, scientific discovery, and a secret rat breeding program. This is Paul Doumer, a Frenchman on a mission. He's come from France to Hanoi to serve as the Governor General of French Indochina and to transform the city into a beacon of modernity and progress. His ambitious plans include city-wide infrastructure development and establishing a trade route to China to recoup his massive 280 million franc loan.
Give me my money back. Do you hear me? I want my money back.
France was watching, and Paul's career and reputation were on the line. Paul faced more than financial struggles, however. Southern Asia was in the midst of the third plague pandemic at the time, and though the outbreak hadn't reached Hanoi yet, fear was rising. Hanoi was a city divided. The French Quarter shone with the pearlescent glow of modernity, while the Annamites were shunned to poverty in the Old Quarter. In the French Quarter, Paul got to work. He wanted a new fresh water system. He wanted new sewer pipes stretched out across the city, 19 kilometers in all, and demanded a flushing toilet in every French palace. Fancy stuff. He wanted city-wide electric lighting. He wanted public transportation and a railway to China. Paul wanted a bridge, and he named it the Paul Doumer Bridge. Doumer also wanted a new medical school, and so he brought in Alexandre Yersin, the conqueror of the plague, to run it. Who better? More on Yersin later. These projects were all very expensive, but perhaps most expensive of all was the Grand Palais, the cost of which would contribute to a decade-long budget deficit before the building was obliterated by American airstrikes towards the end of World War II. The global increase in industrialization combined with Paul's efforts to increase traffic between Hanoi and China improved the economy, but also increased fears that the plague would arrive, so Paul leapt into action once more.
Tally-ho.
First, he sent in the sanitary police. They had powers far beyond what would have been legal in France. European visitors were mostly left alone, but Chinese venturing to Hanoi faced invasive physical inspections, quarantine in the lazaretto, and could have their cargo just taken away. The sanitary police could do pretty much whatever they wanted as long as they kept the plague out. Paul also sent in health inspectors to go door to door looking for any signs of the plague. Are you sick? Forced quarantine. Is your house a bit messy? Forced quarantine. Signs of rats? Forced quarantine, and they might also burn your stuff. Now, the French knew that rats were arriving in Hanoi from China by both land and sea, but they believed that the plague, if it arrived at all, could only fester and grow in the Old Quarter. Sure, a case might pop up here and there, but clean sewers, toilets, and widely available hand soap would prevent a total outbreak, right? In reality, the rats were living and multiplying in the sewers of the French Quarter. It was the perfect habitat for them. Loads of food, no predators, rat paradise. Now jump to April of 1902, and Hanoi's sewers are overrun with rats. There are even reports of rats coming up through people's toilets.
And just consider yourself lucky I didn't get rough on you.
For Paul, the timing couldn't have been worse. He had arranged for an exposition, an expo, to show off just how swell things were going in Hanoi. Officials from France were expected to attend, of course, along with representatives from other colonial powers. The expo was set for November, just 7 months away, and Paul was under a lot of pressure. So backed into a corner, Paul Doumer did the only thing left to do. He ran back to France. Almost immediately after Doumer was gone, the first case of the bubonic plague was confirmed in Hanoi, in the French Quarter. Who could have guessed? Doumer went on to have a very successful political career back home in France. He was eventually elected president in June of 1931. He managed to hold the office for less than a year before being assassinated at a book fair by another Paul, the Russian Paul Gorgulov. While on trial, Gorgulov had claimed to have plans to land on the moon and that he was the mystery man behind the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby, but that's a story for another day. Now let's pause our story in Hanoi for a moment to talk about the third plague pandemic. The first plague pandemic, also known as the early medieval plague or the plague of Justinian, ran from roughly 541 to 767. The second plague pandemic includes the Black Death, which hit medieval Europe in 1346. The third plague pandemic officially began in 1855. It arose from the Yunnan province in China, but was largely ignored by Europe and the Americas until the disease spread to British Hong Kong. By the 1890s, the disease was recognized as a public health crisis, and a global race ensued to identify the pathogen which caused the plague, the vector of transmission, and of course a cure. In 1894, our Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss researcher at the French Pasteur Institute, succeeded in identifying the bacteria despite massive roadblocks against him. In Hong Kong, the British wouldn't let him access their hospitals, so Yersin had to build his own hut to serve as a laboratory and was forced to bribe workers at the morgue to access plague samples. He also had most of his cash stolen. He called the bacteria Pasteurella pestis, but it was officially renamed to Yersinia pestis in Alexander's honor after he died. Yersin developed a serum to counteract the plague and continued to work on his creation while he was in Hanoi. The results were disappointing, but in 1902, Alexandre Yersin was arguably the world's foremost plague expert and was certainly the best candidate to steer Hanoi out of trouble. Side note, to keep his energy up, Yersin developed a drink he called coca, short for cola cannelle. Coca was made from cinnamon, ground up coca leaves, cocaine, sugar, and water. Sound familiar? Anyways, thanks to his colleague Paul-Louis Simon, Yersin knew that the rodent fleas, not the rats themselves, were the vectors of transmission for the bubonic plague. The simplest solution for Hanoi was to get rid of the rats. No more rats meant no more fleas, and no more fleas meant no more plague. But there were hundreds of thousands of rats. French officials toiled over how to get rid of them all. Catch the rats? Of course, but who would do the catching? First, the French tried sending the Vietnamese maintenance workers to get the rats. Unfortunately, the Annamites, as they were being called, which is a bit of an insult by the way, they were not interested in crawling through sewer sludge to risk catching the plague, and they were definitely not interested in doing it for free.
I mean, I'm down.
I don't want that. Okay.
Then the administration had a second brilliant idea. They would pay people to kill the rats, of course. The French weren't interested, of course, but that was alright because at 4 cents per rat, the underpaid and overtaxed Vietnamese would jump at the opportunity. The plan was foolproof and the hunt began. Officials tracked the daily total of rats brought in, and boy did it ramp up quickly. Friday, April 25th, 167 rats. Okay. Saturday, April 26th, 619 rats. Not bad. Wednesday, April 30th, 1,386 rats. In the first week, nearly 8,000 rats were killed and the daily count continued to climb. On May 5th, more than 3,700 dead rats were brought in on a single day. The rat hunt was stampeding along to great success, but it was starting to get expensive for the French. The bounty was dropped to 1 cent per rat, but the daily count kept rising. Monday, May 19th, 7,442 rats. Saturday, May 24th, 10,559 rats. The rats were coming in faster than they could be incinerated, so the French changed the policy. Instead of a full dead rat, you only needed to bring in the tail to collect your bounty.
And this is the rat tail. The rat tail I had for almost 10 years growing up, that my parents now keep in their basement.
Excellent problem solving. Friday, May 30th, 15,041 rats. That's in one day, remember. French officials were stunned by the sheer volume of rats being reported. Until, that is, one of the administrators realized that mouse and vole tails were being mixed in with rat tails. It's easy to see they're different with a direct comparison, but you've got to remember that these tails are being brought in by the tens of thousands every day. Officials made another change to the rules. Now you can only get paid on large tails that obviously belong to an adult rat, and they would be checking all of them closely. Well done, you've closed all of the loopholes. Meanwhile, Alexandre Yersin was distributing his anti-plague serum to anyone he could get his hands on, and the French authorities were testing various vaccines on the Vietnamese at gunpoint. Neither Yersin's serum nor any of the vaccines tested appear to have been effective. June 12th, 20,114 rats in one day. This was getting outrageous. The reward was dropped again, now only 1/2 cent per rat tail. The French were beginning to become suspicious of the high numbers and began to take more detailed reports. They decided to separately record the large tails and the small tails brought in. Great idea. Only one problem. Sometimes the official numbers recorded did not add up properly. On July 3rd, 13,928 adult tails and 2,754 small tails were counted, which added up to 16,708. Not quite right. Despite the math errors, rising costs, and the occasional mouse or vole tail sneaking through, the French were once again pleased with how the hunt was going. They were killing huge numbers of rats. The plague threat, surely, was over. But then, A French health inspector saw something very interesting during his patrol. A rat without a tail. Sacre bleu! The rat hunt began to unravel. It turns out that if you start paying people for dead rats, and if you've been taxing, quarantining, stealing from, vaccinating at gunpoint, and forcing these same people into an underdeveloped corner of the city, instead of helping you out, they might just start rat farms to raise huge bounties without getting their hands covered in sewer waste. They might also smuggle rats into the city in huge shipments. When the French decided that only a tail was required to earn the bounty, the Vietnamese stopped killing the rats altogether. They just cut off the tail and left the rats alive to breed more. The French weren't going to stand for this, but officials couldn't just end the program because if no rats were turned in at all, then the plague was still undoubtedly in Hanoi. To combat against the mischief, the bounty was lowered one more time to 1 cent for every 5 rat tails. Tuesday, July 8th, 16,425 rats. Wednesday, July 9th, 40 rats. Thursday, July 10th, 0 rats. Just as quickly as it had begun, the hunt was over. The price was just not worth the effort, and so the Vietnamese released all of the rats they had in captivity back into the sewers, and the rat population rebounded completely in just a couple of months. In total, 644,922 rat deaths were recorded. Was that accurate? Maybe, but it was around there. Was it worth it? Well, actually, maybe. There were a lot of other anti-plague measures going on at the time, but at the end of the hunt, only 14 cases of the bubonic plague were recorded in Hanoi, and only 8 deaths. Not too bad, all things considered. And at last, the threat of the plague was gone. Until November. Paul Doumer's expo went on without him, and it opened to the world. It went all right at first. Reports sent back to France declared the expo a huge success, and then rats were discovered on the expo grounds. Several buildings were ordered to be burned down at once. The French managed to kill about 1,000 rats like this, but there were still an uncountable number spreading in the sewers. Then, in 1903, the plague returned. This time things got a bit more serious. 213 deaths were recorded, but there is speculation that the real number was 3 to 4 times higher because the French couldn't be sure they'd counted all of the cases in the old quarter. So they fired up the rat hunt again. But this time the Annamites, aka the Vietnamese nationals, weren't taking part. This time around, the French had shut down all of the rat farms and were monitoring the routes smugglers had used to get rats into the city. The plague eventually subsided, but the rat hunt experiment had failed. And at last, the rat hunt was over, and everyone learned their lesson. Until the 1930s, Hanoi was dealing with another rat infestation brought about by seasonal flooding. Then, an official working in the mayor's office had a brilliant idea. He suggested the government could offer a bounty for dead rats turned in. The French probably wouldn't be interested, but the Vietnamese would surely take up the hunt. The plan was foolproof, but alas, it was turned down. And that really was the end of the rat hunt. This phenomenon is called a perverse incentive, where you offer a solution to a problem, but the incentive is structured in a way that your solution actually makes the problem worse. It's sometimes called the Cobra effect. There's a story that the British government in India offered a reward for killing the huge number of Indian cobras that were reportedly attacking children. When the government discovered that locals had been breeding snakes to collect the bounty, officials set all of the farmed cobras free, which resulted in a lot more attacks. That's how the story goes anyways. Many people believe the whole cobra incident never actually happened. The Hanoi Rat Hunt, on the other hand, is extremely well documented. Subscribe to the channel and like this video. Most of the facts featured in this video come from the graphic novel The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt by Michael G. Vann and Liz Clarke, and many of the sources included therein.